The dust settled on the road as Julia Clarke watched her dreams crumble along with the stagecoach wheel. She'd traveled all the way from Boston to Jerome Junction, Arizona territory, with nothing but determination and her late father's pocket watch, only to find herself stranded at the edge of civilization in 1879, with mining claims that might be worthless. "Miss, are you certain about this?" The stagecoach driver scratched his gray beard, squinting at the crude map in Julia's hands. "That mine's been abandoned for years. Silver ran out, they say." "My father wouldn't have left me worthless claims." Julia straightened her travel-worn skirt. At 24, she'd already experienced enough loss to last a lifetime, her mother to tuberculosis when she was 12, and now her father to a sudden heart attack. "The deed is legitimate. All I need is transportation to the site." The driver shook his head. "Nearest livery stable's in town. Half-mile walk that way." He pointed down the dusty road before climbing back onto his coach. Julia gathered her carpetbag and hat box, her only possessions besides the mining documents. The weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders as heavily as the afternoon sun. Her father's attorney had made it sound so simple: travel west, claim her inheritance, sell it to a mining company, and return east with enough money to start a new life. Nothing about the West was simple. Jerome Junction sprawled before her, a collection of wooden buildings, false fronts, and perpetual dust. As she entered the main street, Julia noticed the typical establishments: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various businesses catering to miners and cattlemen. The town smelled of livestock, wood smoke, and desperation. The livery stable sat at the far end of town, its weathered signs swinging in the hot breeze. As she approached, Julia heard the rhythmic sound of a hammer against metal. She peered into the dim interior, where a tall figure worked over a glowing forge. "Excuse me," she called, setting down her bags. "I need transportation to the Silverlode mine." The figure straightened, revealing a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s. His face, partially shadowed by a well-worn cowboy hat, bore the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. When he turned toward her, Julia was struck by eyes the color of a summer storm. "Silverlode?" He set down his hammer. "Nobody's been out there in years. Not since the cave-in." "Cave-in?" Julia felt her stomach drop. "Yes, madam." He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. 3 years back. Mine's not safe." "But I have papers." Julia opened her carpet bag, frantically searching for the deed. "My father. He left me claims there." The blacksmith approached, removing his hat. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and a smudge of soot marked his tanned cheek. "Kent Thompson," he introduced himself. "I do smithing work and run the livery." "Julia Clarke." She extended the documents, her hand trembling slightly. "Please, can you tell me if these are worthless?" Kent studied the papers, his expression unreadable. "These look legitimate," he finally said. "Your father was Elias Clarke?" Julia nodded. "He came through here about 5 years ago, bought several claims, hired men to work them. I remember him good man, fair with his workers. But after the accident, he never returned." "He went back east," Julia explained. "He was planning to return with more investors, but his health failed." Kent handed the papers back. "I'm sorry about your father, Miss Clarke, but those mines aren't safe, and they're likely played out anyway." "I have to see for myself." Julia lifted her chin. "Will you rent me a horse?" Kent studied her determined face. "No offense, madam, but you don't look like you've spent much time on horseback, and that mine's a good 3 hours' ride through rough country." "Then what do you suggest, Mr. Thompson?" Julia asked, frustration edging her voice. "I've come all this way. I can't simply turn around." A moment passed as Kent considered her situation. "I'm heading that direction tomorrow to check on some cattle my brother's running. I could take you." "You would do that?" Julia asked, suspicion coloring her voice. "For a fee," Kent clarified, "and on one condition: you follow my lead when we're out there. The old mines are dangerous." Julia considered his offer. "How much?" $3, Kent replied. "Includes a horse and my guidance." It was reasonable, especially considering alternatives. "Agreed. When do we leave?" Dawn, Kent said, settling his hat back on his head. You'll need proper clothing. That dress won't do you any favors on the trail. Julia glanced down at her travel suit. I have nothing else, Kent sighed. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile might have something suitable. Tell her I sent you. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Julia gathered her bags. Where should I stay tonight? Miner's Rest at the end of the street. Basic but clean. Kent returned to his forge. Dawn, Miss Clarke. I don't wait for stragglers. At the Mercantile, Julia found herself explaining her situation again to a motherly woman with gray-streaked brown hair. Mining claims? Mrs. Henderson shook her head. And Kent's taking you out there? Well, you couldn't ask for a better guide. That boy knows every inch of this territory. Julia purchased canvas trousers, a sturdy shirt, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, all considerably too large, but the only options available. He lost his father in a mining accident when he was 15, Mrs. Henderson said as she wrapped the items. Been on his own since then, raising his younger brother. Built that smithy business from nothing. He seems... Julia searched for the right word. Capable, Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. That he is, one of the few reliable men in these parts. The Miner's Rest proved basic indeed. A narrow bed, washstand, and chair occupied the small room. But after months of travel, even this sparse accommodation felt luxurious. Julia washed the dust from her face, changed into her nightgown, and fell into an exhausted sleep. The knock at her door came too soon. The gray light of dawn barely filtered through the thin curtains as Julia dressed in her new clothes, feeling awkward and conspicuous in the men's attire. She braided her chestnut hair and tucked it under the hat, taking one last glance in the small mirror. The woman who looked back seemed a stranger, determined but frightened. Kent waited with 2 saddled horses, looking annoyingly alert for the early hour. You'll ride Daisy, he said, indicating a dun-colored mare. She's steady, good for beginners. I've ridden before, Julia protested, though her experience was limited to gentle ponies in Boston parks. Kent gave her a skeptical look. We'll see. The first hour proved humbling. Though Daisy was indeed steady, the rocky terrain demanded skills Julia didn't possess. Kent rode slightly ahead, occasionally glancing back but saying little. His own mount, a large black gelding, navigated the difficult path with ease. We'll rest here, Kent finally announced, dismounting beside a small creek. Water the horses. Julia slid from the saddle, wincing at the soreness in her legs. How much farther? About 2 hours. Kent knelt by the creek, filling his canteen. You're doing better than I expected. From him, it almost sounded like praise. Julia led Daisy to drink, then sat on a rock, massaging her aching thighs. Why did you stay? She asked, after the cave-in when others left. Kent was silent so long Julia thought he might not answer. This is my home, he finally said. My father worked these mountains. My brother and I were born here. And your mother? Died when Sam was born. Kent's voice held no self-pity, just statement of fact. It happens out here. I'm sorry. Julia watched a hawk circle overhead. My mother passed when I was 12. Kent nodded, acknowledging their shared experience without empty platitudes. We should move. Storm's coming later. Julia hadn't noticed any change in the clear blue sky, but something in his certainty made her hurry back to her mount. The terrain grew more challenging, steep switchbacks leading up into mining country. Ancient pine trees gave way to stunted juniper and exposed rock. Abandoned equipment lay scattered beside collapsed structures, silent monuments to broken dreams. There, Kent pointed to a hillside where weathered timbers marked a mine entrance. Silverlode. Julia stared at her inheritance. The main shaft entrance was partially collapsed, with a wooden sign warning "Danger" nailed across what remained of the opening. Several smaller outbuildings stood nearby, their roofs fallen in, windows long since shattered. It doesn't look promising, she admitted. Looks can be deceiving. Kent dismounted, tying his horse to a juniper. Your father worked the upper shafts mostly. Main collapse was in the lower section. Hope flickered within Julia. So there might still be silver. Possibly. We'll need light to see anything useful. From his saddlebag, Kent removed several candles and a small lantern. Stay behind me, he instructed as they approached the mine entrance. Step only where I step. The warning on the mine entrance made Julia hesitate. Is it truly safe? Not entirely, Kent admitted, but I've been in these mines since I was a boy. I know the signs of danger. They pushed aside the weathered planks and entered the cool darkness. Kent lit the lantern, revealing a tunnel reinforced with timber supports. The air smelled of earth and decay, with the faintest metallic hint. Watch your head, Kent warned as they ventured deeper. The tunnel sloped downward, the footing increasingly treacherous with loose rock and abandoned tools. How far down does it go? Julia asked, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. This shaft runs about 200 feet before joining the main chamber. From there, several smaller tunnels branch out following the veins. Kent held the lantern higher. Your father was focusing on the eastern branch before the accident. The tunnel widened into a chamber where rusted equipment lay abandoned. Julia noticed marks on the walls, silvery streaks that caught the lantern light. Is that? She stepped closer. Traces, Kent confirmed, but see how thin the vein is? They followed it until it nearly vanished. Then it is worthless. Julia's shoulders slumped. I didn't say that. Kent moved toward a narrow passage to their right. Sometimes veins pinch out, then widen again. Mining's a gamble. As they ventured into the side tunnel, the air grew thicker with dust. Julia coughed, pulling her bandana up to cover her nose and mouth. Not much farther, Kent assured her. There should be marker stakes showing your father's claims. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing them to proceed in single file. Kent's broad shoulders nearly touched both walls as he ducked under low-hanging support beams. Julia followed closely, trying to ignore the increasing weight of mountain above them. A distant rumble made them both freeze. Thunder? Julia whispered hopefully. Kent's expression grew serious. No, something shifted. He raised the lantern, studying the ceiling. We should head back. They had turned to retrace their steps when a louder rumble shook the tunnel. Small rocks and dust showered down around them. Kent grabbed Julia's arm, pulling her forward as a section of ceiling collapsed behind them. Run! He shouted, pushing her ahead while holding the lantern high. They raced through the tunnel as more debris fell. Julia could barely see through the thick dust, her lungs burning with each breath. Another violent shake sent her stumbling into the wall. She felt Kent's hand steady her, urging her onward. Then darkness, complete and absolute. The lantern! Julia cried out, panic rising in her throat. It's out! Kent's voice came from just beside her. She felt his hand find hers, fingers interlacing. Hold my hand. We'll find the light. His grip was steady, warm against her trembling fingers. I can't see anything, Julia whispered, fighting the edge of hysteria in her voice. I know this tunnel, Kent assured her. Keep your left shoulder against the wall. Small steps. I won't let go. They moved slowly through the suffocating darkness. Julia concentrated on the pressure of Kent's hand around hers, using it as an anchor against the crushing fear. Each step was a test of faith in a man she'd known less than a day. Talk to me, Kent said after several minutes of tense silence. It helps keep panic away. About what? Julia's voice sounded small in the vast darkness. Anything. Why'd your father leave Boston to mine silver? Julia focused on the question, grateful for the distraction. He was an accountant, respectable job, steady income, but he always dreamed of more. After my mother died, something changed in him. He started investing in Western ventures. Said life was too short to count other men's money. Smart man, Kent commented as they navigated around what felt like a fallen timber. Not according to Boston society. Julia's bitter laugh echoed in the tunnel. They called him eccentric at best, foolish at worst. When he left for Arizona, many predicted he'd return penniless. Did he find what he was looking for out here? Kent's voice held genuine curiosity. Julia considered the question. I think so. His letters were full of life in a way they hadn't been for years. He wrote about the mountains, the sky, the freedom. He seemed happy. That's worth something. Kent said softly. Many men live their whole lives without finding what makes them feel alive. A faint glow appeared ahead, so dim Julia thought she might be imagining it. Light, Kent confirmed, squeezing her hand. Entrance isn't far now. As they approached the mine opening, the rumbling sound came again, more violent than before. Kent pulled Julia close against him as dust and rocks showered down. "Run!" he shouted. They sprinted the final distance, bursting out into the late afternoon sunlight as a cloud of dust billowed from the mine entrance. Behind them, the support timbers gave way with a terrible cracking sound. The entrance collapsed entirely, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble where they had stood moments before. They stood gasping in the sunlight, covered in gray dust, still holding hands. Kent looked down at their intertwined fingers, then slowly released his grip. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. Julia shook her head, then started laughing, a slightly hysterical release of tension. "My inheritance just collapsed before my eyes." Kent's mouth quirked into a half smile. "At least it waited until we were out." The sky had darkened while they were inside, clouds building to the west. "Storm's coming," Kent observed. "We need to get back before it hits." Julia looked back at the collapsed mine entrance. "There's nothing left for me here, is there?" Kent studied the hillside thoughtfully. "The mine's gone, but the land still has value. Water source, timber. Might make a decent ranch someday." "I don't know the first thing about ranching," Julia said, brushing dust from her clothes. "Most folks don't when they start." Kent untied the horses, which had fortunately remained where he'd left them. Arizona territory's full of people reinventing themselves. As they mounted, the first drops of rain began to fall. They rode quickly, racing the approaching storm. The terrain seemed even more challenging on the return journey, now slick with rain. Julia concentrated on staying in the saddle, following Kent's lead as the sky darkened further. By the time they reached the valley, rain fell in sheets. Kent pointed to a small cabin set among the trees. "Line shack," he explained, "used during roundup. We'll wait out the worst of it." The one-room structure was basic, but sound. Kent quickly started a fire in the small stove, while Julia stood dripping in the doorway. "There are dry clothes in that trunk," Kent said, nodding toward a wooden chest. "Old but clean. I'll step outside while you change." Before Julia could protest, he slipped out the door. She opened the trunk to find several flannel shirts and worn jeans. She selected the smallest items, changing quickly out of her soaked clothing. The shirt hung to mid-thigh, the sleeves rolled up several times. She was just finishing when Kent knocked. "Decent?" he called. "Yes," she answered, suddenly self-conscious in the borrowed men's clothing. Kent entered, his own clothes soaked through. He carried an armful of firewood, which he stacked beside the stove. Without comment, he took dry clothes from the trunk and stepped back outside to change. Julia used the opportunity to assess the cabin. A narrow bunk covered with blankets occupied one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. Basic supplies lined a shelf: coffee, beans, flour, salt pork. Outside, the rain hammered on the roof, punctuated by occasional thunder. Kent returned wearing dry clothes, his wet ones bundled under his arm. He hung both their wet garments on pegs near the stove, then set about making coffee. "We'll have to stay here tonight," he said matter-of-factly. "Creek will be too swollen to cross safely." Julia stared at him, suddenly aware of their situation alone in a remote cabin, miles from town. That would be improper. Kent raised an eyebrow as he measured coffee grounds. "Miss Clarke, out here impropriety takes a backseat to survival. You're welcome to ride back in the flood if your reputation concerns you that much." His bluntness shocked her into silence. Of course he was right, they had no choice. Still, she couldn't help thinking what Boston society would say about a night spent unchaperoned with a strange man. "I'll take the floor," Kent added, pouring water into the coffee pot. "You can have the bunk." Julia sat at the table, suddenly exhausted. "I apologize. Everything here is so different from what I'm accustomed to." Kent set the pot on the stove. Why did you come? Truly. You could have sold those claims from Boston. For almost nothing, Julia replied. Father's attorney said they might be worth 10 times more if I came in person, proved their value. She sighed. But I think I also wanted to see what drew him here. What made him leave everything familiar behind? Kent nodded, understanding in his eyes. And have you found it? I'm not sure yet. Julia looked around the simple cabin, listening to the wild storm outside. But I understand him better now, I think. As the coffee brewed, Kent rummaged through the supplies, producing beans, salt pork, and hardtack. Not fancy, but it'll fill your stomach. They ate in companionable silence. The simplest meal somehow tasting better than any Julia had eaten in Boston's finest establishments. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin grew warm and comfortable. Tell me about your brother, Julia said as Kent poured more coffee. A smile softened his weathered face. Sam's 17, smart as a whip, working cattle for now, but I'm saving to send him to school in Denver next year. He has a head for numbers, could be an engineer. You raised him well, Julia observed. Kent shrugged. Did what needed doing. He deserves his chance. And what about your chance? Julia asked. What do you want for yourself? The question seemed to surprise him. Never really thought about it that way. After Pa died, it was about surviving, then making sure Sam had opportunities. And now? Kent gazed into his coffee cup. Land of my own, I suppose. Enough cattle to build something worth passing on someday. To children? Julia asked. A slight flush colored Kent's tan cheeks. That would require a wife first. No prospects in Jerome Junction? Julia teased, surprised at her own boldness. Kent's storm gray eyes met hers. Few women willing to take on the hardships out here. Fewer still I'd be interested in. Something in his steady gaze made Julia's heart beat faster. She looked away, suddenly flustered. It's growing late, Kent nodded, rising to check the door was securely latched. Storm's settling in for the night. You should get some rest. Julia moved to the bunk, awkward with the realization they would spend the night in such close quarters. Kent laid out blankets on the floor near the stove, then extinguished the lantern. The cabin fell into darkness, illuminated only by the orange glow from the stove's vents. Mr. Thompson, Julia's voice sounded small in the darkness. Kent, he corrected, seems foolish to stand on formality now. Kent, she repeated, thank you for saving my life today. A long pause followed. Get some sleep, Julia. Morning arrived with brilliant clarity, the storm having washed the world clean. Julia woke to find Kent already up, tending the fire and preparing a simple breakfast. She felt strangely comfortable in his presence now, as if their shared danger had created a bond that transcended their brief acquaintance. Creek's still high, Kent reported as they ate, but passable. We should reach town by noon. Julia nodded, suddenly reluctant to return to civilization and the uncertainties awaiting her. What will you do today? Forge needs attention. Got horseshoes to finish for the Barton spread. Kent poured the last of the coffee into her cup. What about you? The question highlighted her lack of options. I suppose I'll need to contact my father's attorney, see about selling the land. Kent studied her face. No rush to decide. Land's been there a long time. We'll be there tomorrow. They rode back mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Jerome Junction, the familiar building seemed different to Julia now, less intimidating, more like a place where she might belong. At the livery, Kent helped her dismount. Their hands met briefly as he steadied her, that same spark of connection flaring between them. Thank you for everything, Julia said, reluctant to end their time together. What do I owe you? Nothing, Kent replied. Consider it payment for the entertainment of watching a Boston lady navigate mining country. His teasing tone made her smile. Will I see you again? Town's not that big, Kent answered, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't dismissing the idea. I imagine our paths will cross. Julia returned to the hotel, bathed away the dust of their adventure, and changed back into one of her proper dresses. Yet, As she pinned up her hair and resumed the appearance of a proper Boston lady, she felt like an imposter. Something had shifted within her, some fundamental understanding of herself and what she wanted from life. The following days passed in a strange limbo. Julia telegraphed her father's attorney explaining the mine's collapse, but indicating she might be interested in keeping the land. She explored the small town, gradually meeting its inhabitants and learning its rhythms. Every day included a seemingly accidental encounter with Kent passing on the street, a brief conversation at the general store, a nod from across the dining room at the hotel. A week after their adventure, Julia was having tea at Mrs. Henderson's home when the older woman finally addressed what the entire town had been gossiping about. "So you and Kent Thompson spent a night alone in that line shack," Mrs. Henderson said, pouring more tea. "Quite scandalous by Eastern standards, I'd imagine." Julia nearly choked on her tea. "It wasn't we didn't," Mrs. Henderson laughed. "My dear, I'm not judging. Kent's the finest man in the territory. Half the unmarried women have set their caps for him, but he's never shown interest. Until now." "I don't know what you mean," Julia protested, though her warming cheeks betrayed her. "He's been at my store 3 times this week asking about you," Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing smile. "Kent Thompson hasn't set foot in my millinery section in all the years I've known him." That evening, as Julia walked back from dinner at the small hotel restaurant, she found Kent waiting on the porch, hat in hand. "Evening," he greeted her, an unusual uncertainty in his manner. "Good evening, Kent." Julia's pulse quickened at the sight of him. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance: clean shirt, hair neatly combed, boots polished. "I was wondering if you might like to see more of the area," he said. "There's a spot up near Granite Mountain, good view of the whole valley." Julia recognized the invitation for what it was: not just a ride, but a statement of interest. "I'd like that very much." Relief and pleasure mingled in Kent's smile. "Sunday afternoon, I'll bring a proper picnic, not trail rations." Sunday would be perfect. The Sunday outing became the first of many. Throughout the autumn, Kent showed Julia the territory's hidden treasures: pristine lakes nestled in mountains, ancient cliff dwellings, meadows carpeted with wildflowers. With each excursion, their connection deepened. Kent revealed himself to be not just the capable frontiersman she'd first encountered, but a man of surprising thoughtfulness and quiet ambition. Julia found herself telling him things she'd never shared with anyone: her conflicted feelings about Boston society, her secret dreams of writing adventure stories, her fears that she was disappointing her father's memory by not knowing what to do with his legacy. "Your father wanted you to live fully," Kent told her one evening as they watched the sunset from a high ridge, "not just follow his dreams or Boston's expectations." "And what about your dreams?" Julia asked. "Sending Sam to school, building your own ranch?" Kent's hand found hers, fingers intertwining in what had become a familiar gesture. Dreams change, evolve. The first snow of winter arrived in early December, transforming Jerome Junction into a scene from a Christmas card. By then, Julia had moved from the hotel to a small house she rented from the widow Peterson. She had taken a position helping at the schoolhouse 3 days a week, discovering an unexpected talent for teaching. Kent called on her properly now, taking Sunday dinner at her table, escorting her to the town's modest social gatherings. Together they attended the Christmas Eve service at the small clapboard church, then walked through the silent, snow-covered streets. "I have something for you," Kent said as they reached her gate. He pulled a small package from his coat pocket. Julia unwrapped it to find a silver pendant, a delicate rose with leaves crafted of the same metal. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching it reverently. "Made it myself," Kent admitted, "from silver ore I found on your land." Julia looked up in surprise. "My land?" "But the mine collapsed." "Been doing some exploring," Kent explained. "There's another vein, smaller but promising, in the hillside behind the old shaft. Not enough for a commercial operation, but—" he shrugged. "Thought you should have something from your father's silver." Tears welled in Julia's eyes. She reached up, touching Kent's face with her gloved hand. "It's perfect. Would you put it on for me?" Kent fastened the pendant around her neck. his fingers brushing her skin. When he finished, he didn't step away. Snow fell softly around them as he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like coming home. That winter passed in a haze of contentment Julia had never imagined possible. Kent spent every free moment either with her or working on a small cabin on a plot of land adjoining her father's claim. He'd purchased it with his savings, explaining that with the water source on her land and the good grazing on his, together they made a viable ranch. Together, Julia had repeated, understanding his meaning. Kent had taken her hand then, his expression serious. "I'm not a wealthy man, Julia. Don't have fancy education or society manners, but I love you. Have since you stood up in that mine, covered in dust, and laughed at losing your inheritance." "Ask me," Julia had whispered. "Marry me," Kent said. "Build something here with me." Their wedding took place in early spring, with wildflowers carpeting the valley and new leaves budding on the aspen trees. The entire town attended the ceremony in the small church, followed by a celebration at the newly completed Thompson ranch house. Sam returned from his first semester at school in Denver, proudly showing Julia his excellent marks and thanking her for the book she'd sent. "You'll be staying on for good then?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she helped Julia arrange food on the long tables. Julia looked across the yard where Kent was showing several men the barn he'd built, his face animated with pride and happiness. "Yes," she said with certainty, "this is home now." "Your father would be pleased," the older woman observed. "He talked about you often, you know. Hoped you'd find your place here someday." That evening, after the guests had departed, Kent and Julia stood on the porch of their new home, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "No regrets?" Kent asked, his arm around her waist. "About Boston, the life you left behind?" Julia leaned into his embrace. "None. I came looking for silver and found something far more valuable." Kent turned her to face him, his expression serious. "I promised myself I'd never go down in the mines again after my father died. Breaking that promise to help you was the best decision I ever made." "Even though the lantern went out and we nearly died?" Julia teased. Kent's hand found hers, fingers interlacing in the gesture that had become their own private symbol. "Especially then. That's when I knew." "Knew what?" "That I'd follow you anywhere, through any darkness." He lifted their joined hands. "We'll find the light together." Over the years that followed, their prediction proved true. The small ranch prospered, expanding as they acquired adjacent properties. The silver vein Kent discovered yielded enough to build a comfortable life without the dangers of large-scale mining. Sam completed his education and returned to Arizona Territory as a mining engineer, helping other operations work safely while developing the family's modest silver extraction. Julia found her voice as a writer, penning stories of frontier life that found an eager audience back east. Her authentic tales of the West, its people, and its challenges offered readers a glimpse into a world most would never experience firsthand. Children came first: twins, a boy and girl who inherited Kent's storm-gray eyes and Julia's determined spirit, then a second son who combined his father's practical nature with his mother's love of stories. They grew up riding the ranges, learning both ranching and mining, and absorbing the values of the community that had embraced their parents. On their 20th anniversary, Kent took Julia back to the site of the collapsed mine where their journey together had begun. The landscape had changed, the dangerous entrance had been properly sealed, the surrounding land transformed into productive pasture. Only the distant mountains remained the same, silent witnesses to their shared history. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that lantern hadn't gone out," Julia mused as they sat on horseback overlooking the valley. "If we'd simply inspected the mine and returned to town." Kent considered her question. "I'd like to think we'd have found our way to each other eventually, but I'm grateful for the darkness." "Why?" Julia asked, though she already knew his answer. Kent reached across the space between their horses, his hand finding hers with the same certainty as that first time in the mine. Because that's when I held your hand, when we promised to find the light together." His eyes, still the color of a storm, even with the gray now threading his dark hair, held the same steady devotion they had for 2 decades. "And we did, Julia. We found it together." As the sun set over the mountains they both loved, Julia's free hand touched the silver rose she still wore every day. From Boston accountant's daughter to Arizona rancher's wife, her journey had taken her far from the path she'd expected to travel. Yet as Kent's hand warmed hers, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found the true inheritance her father had hoped for her, not silver from the earth, but a life rich with purpose, love, and the courage to forge her own trail through whatever darkness might come.